This is Judaism Unbound, episode 476, Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, episode 1, Spiritual Chutzpah. We are proud to introduce the third podcast in the Judaism Unbound family of podcasts, Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, hosted by Jericho Vincent. We are the ancestors of the future. This new podcast offers a spiritual home for listeners seeking to connect Jewish ancestral feminist wisdom with their own svara, moral intuition. Each episode of this limited series delves into a different story of our ancestor Miriam, illuminating her mystical teachings and offering practical tools for navigating and flourishing in personal or political spiritual wildernesses. Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness charts a radical, fresh Jewish path for its listeners and the world. We're thrilled here at Judaism Unbound to periodically feature episodes of Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness here on our feed. But we don't only feature those episodes alone. Lex Rofeberg, that's me, and Rena Yehuda Newman, two members of Judaism Unbound's team, supplement each episode with some Gemara, commentary, as well. We hope that our ideas will help spur you to form your own Gemara, your own commentaries, and channel your unique teachings about this podcast and beyond into the world. Without further ado, here's Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness.
How are you doing? How is this political moment hitting? How are you holding up in the avalanche of very shitty news? And Lord knows what you've got going on in your personal life, what you're carrying on your shoulders. So please, take a breath. Here's the thing. For some of us, this moment can feel like disaster, like the end of the world. But it's not the first time in history that our people have found themselves afraid, vulnerable, lost in spiritual wilderness. Jewish people get some things wrong, but one thing we're very good at is cultivating wisdom for surviving terrible situations. I want to share with you some of that Jewish wisdom. This wisdom is based on the Torah of Miriam. Each episode we're going to explore one of the 5 elements of Miriam's core Torah through stories and teachings and a meditative practice. This is not archaeological Torah. This is ancient living Torah. It draws on mystical wisdom that was kept secret for many generations. My teacher, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, believed now is the time to share these secrets with people of all backgrounds. He thought that every major faith tradition has essential vitamins to offer the world.
The people who are most alive are the hyphenated ones, who have gotten a little vitamin from another discipline, from another tradition, from another religion, and those people are more alive.
So whether you're Jewish, Jewish, or not Jewish, I'm so glad to be here with you today to explore this living Torah, this survival guide for a spiritual wilderness, a gift of Jewish wisdom from the ancestors to you. In this episode, we'll talk about the power of a Sufi sermon, the narrow place, spiritual chutzpah, razzle-dazzle slave economics, time travel, Mashiach Zeit, and a practice for bringing Miriam's living Torah into our own lives. I'm Jericho Vincent, your local feminist, trans, Kabbalistic rabbi, and this is a survival guide for a spiritual wilderness. Let's get started on the path. Imagine a mosque in downtown Manhattan, room with white painted brick walls, about 60 people kneeling on carpets. The walls are still resonating with the Sufi poetry of the evening prayers. In the front of the mosque, a woman wearing a white cap and shawl, the Sheikha, female Sufi leader. With some opening blessings, the Sheikha begins her sermon. It's about Miriam. Miriam who guided the ancestors out of slavery. Miriam the prophet. Miriam the superstar who led the people to freedom with her song and her dancing. Miriam and, oh yeah, almost forgot to mention, her 2 backup singers, Moses and Aaron. In the Sheikha's audience at the back of the mosque, there's a seeker in their early 20s, curly hair cut short, wearing red Pokemon t-shirt, baggy jeans, and their mouth is slack eyes gaping, mind blown. That seeker, that's me.
I grew up in an ultra-Orthodox rabbinical Jewish family. I knew all about Miriam, a bit character, a member of the supporting cast. She was practically an extra
on the set of the big grand story of superheroes, Moses and Aaron. Women always were. To be the main character, you had to be a man. It turned my world inside out when I heard the Sheikah put Miriam in the spotlight, allowing me to see Miriam in her full power. There was so much spiritual chutzpah in that move to realize, wait, we can tell this very old patriarchal story in a totally new way, in a way that shifts focus and lets non-men identify with the hero, that liberates instead of limits. And then when you start reworking the story, it awakens this curiosity. Wait, who's been making choices about how we tell this story up till now? And wait, what do those people leave on the cutting room floor? What the Sheikah did, putting Miriam in the middle of the story, it shifted the trajectory of my life. I'm non-binary, but I was raised as a girl in this culture where only men could be spiritual leaders. Only men could know the will of God. Women's public voices were immodest. Women and girls had to keep quiet and obey. In my family, our lives revolved around my father's decisions and desires, and I didn't question it. I just wanted to be close to him. When we'd gather for Sabbath meals, I'd beg to be seated next to my father, and when he gave his little sermons at the meal, my brothers and sisters would be fidgeting, waiting for him to finish, but I sat by his side, soaking in every word he said. But when I was 12, my oldest sister, who was 18, got married. On one of the first big holidays after the wedding, she came home to visit with her new husband, who was put in that seat next to my father that was usually mine. And I was told to sit at the end of the table with the rest of the girls. During this meal, instead of directing his words of wisdom to me like he usually did, my father started sharing his thoughts with my new brother-in-law and my older brother, and he wasn't speaking English. My father was speaking in this patois of Aramaic, Yiddish, and Hebrew that men of my community spoke, a language that he did not use with me and that I did not understand. I felt a wave of frustration. I wanted to be close to my father. I wanted to learn his Torah, his wisdom. I had this surge of chutzpah, not from any desire to act out, but simply from this sense that I was being blocked from the truth. And I called out from the end of the table, Tati, that's Yiddish for father. I said, Tati, can you please explain that in English? The room fell silent. One of my sisters snickered and said, someone wants attention. I'd understood that I was a girl, but I hadn't fully understood what that meant until that moment. I hadn't realized that because my family thought I was a girl, I could not be part of what mattered most, the very core of our spiritual lives. Only men could be in the thick of it. So when I heard the Sheikah center Miriam, it brought me back to my parents' dining room, to that moment when I'd been put in my place. And I saw Miriam smiling at me, saying, you've got the right instinct. Come with me. There's another way. I fell in love with Miriam. Since then, she's been my guide through many of the spiritual wildernesses that I have wandered. I would not be a rabbi today without her. I love that I met Miriam because of the Sheikah's spiritual chutzpah, and that she impacted me so deeply because of my chutzpah as a child, because one of Miriam's major attributes is spiritual chutzpah, and that's the first tool in our survival guide. Spiritual chutzpah is essential for surviving and thriving in any spiritual wilderness, whether it's familial, religious, communal, or political. Long ago, the ancestors of the Jews were called the Ivri people. First, the Ivri people were a family, and then they grew into a clan of tribes. When a famine hit, they immigrated to Egypt, and after some time passed, the Egyptians turned on these refugees, and they enslaved them. In the Hebrew Bible, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which literally means a narrow place. The mystics say that no matter who we are or where we're living, any of us can find ourselves trapped in Mitzrayim, a narrow place, a spiritual wilderness where we feel disempowered, vulnerable, lost. One day, the Pharaoh's oracles come to him and say, an Ivri boy child will soon be born who is going to free the Ivri slaves. The Pharaoh could not have that. The entire Egyptian economy was predicated on the existence of an Ivri slave class. See, 1% of Egyptians hoarded 30% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% of the population had to make do with just 2.6% of the wealth. The way to ensure that the ultra-wealthy could hold on to their money was to distract the poor by keeping them at each other's throats, distract them with conflicts on nationality, race, gender, anything other than money. All the low-income Egyptians were offered minimum wage jobs overseeing Ivri slaves. They were taught to fear and hate Ivri people, to stress about their impending uprising. The Pharaoh gave him the old razzle-dazzle to keep him occupied, and he and his kids and his cronies kept eating caviar off of diamond spoons. If some Ivri boy child is going to help Ivri slaves seize their freedom, the Pharaoh's whole hierarchy of power would come undone. What's Pharaoh going to do to keep his pyramid from toppling? If the oracles say an Ivri boy child is going to one day grow up to free the Ivri slaves, well, kill all the newborn Ivri boy children. So Egyptian soldiers start monitoring Ivri pregnancies. They set up a surveillance system to scan Ivri neighborhoods for the wail of newborn babies. If they find a newborn and it's a boy, the soldiers take him and kill him. In the Ivri community, there's a power couple. Yocheved, she's the chief OBGYN of the Ivri people, and Amram, a dreamer of shamanic dreams. They already have 2 young children, Aaron and Miriam. Amram and Yocheved are devastated by the Pharaoh's edict, so they decide to separate, so no new children will be born to avoid the risk of having a boy child who might be killed. And all the other couples in the community follow their lead and also separate. The ancient text of the Talmud tells us that little Miriam, their young child, marches up to her dad Amram and says, "You're worse than Pharaoh." Amram is stunned by this accusation, but he's a wise man, and he already senses that there's something special about this daughter of his, so he says, "Why?" Miriam says, "Pharaoh made a decree against Ivri boys, but your choice means we won't have Ivri boys or girls. Also, who's to say that the Pharaoh's will shall actually come to pass? When you preemptively surrender, you actualize your own worst fears. Our people call the divine Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. I will be what I will be. God is mystery. You're submitting your will to what you assume is inevitable. Leave a little room for other possible futures." Imagine the spiritual chutzpah of this child. Her community is crumbling under the Pharaoh's edict. Her family is being torn apart as her parents are separating, personally and politically. Her world is bleak, and the future looks worse. But yet, somehow, Miriam has the spiritual chutzpah to imagine possibilities different from the ones that everyone insists are facts. She can imagine perhaps the Pharaoh's not as all-powerful as he claims he is. She can imagine a better world. And then Miriam has the audacity to believe her own radical imagination, not to dismiss it as naive, but to take it seriously and to act on it with confidence by challenging her father, this major authority figure. When I was a kid and I challenged my father at the Sabbath table by asking to be a part of the men's conversation, that conversation about Torah, sacred wisdom, I was shamed by my family, and that shaming wounded me. It was powerful to realize that in some small way, without knowing it, what I was doing then was not embarrassing or sinful. I was stepping into the lineage of Miriam.
And it's very possible that you have already, in your own life, stepped into the lineage of Miriam, or you're about to.
Miriam's spiritual chutzpah changes the fate of her family, her people, and ultimately world history and most of our lives, because Miriam's father and mother listen to her. They get back together. They conceive a child, Moses. We'll talk about what happens next in our second episode, but let's pause here to really savor Miriam's spiritual chutzpah. Pharaoh says, "This is how it's going to be. All your babies are going to die." Miriam's dad says, guess we better get with the program and adjust accordingly. But Miriam, she has the inner spaciousness, the creativity to say, don't obey in advance. Instead, imagine a radical tomorrow that looks nothing like today. As my dear friend Rabbi Tzvika Krieger, rabbi of Chochmat Halev, says,
what was so audacious about Miriam was not so much that she confronted her parents, but it's that when everyone was reconciled to a hopeless future, she dared to present a hopeful vision.
from the perspective of Kabbalah, every single one of us has a similar capacity for spiritual chutzpah. This capacity can be strengthened with inspiration, with practice, with ancestral guidance. I want to define this capacity that you have within. You practice spiritual chutzpah when you raise the axe of radical imagination to splinter an oppressive fact of life and unleash a flood of justice, healing, and creativity. Let's do that again. You practice spiritual chutzpah when you raise the axe of radical imagination to splinter an oppressive fact of life and unleash a flood of justice, healing, and creativity. Facts say only men can be the heroes of ancestral stories. My Sheikha splintered that fact with her radical imagination, putting Miriam in the center. Facts say this is the end of the world, climate apocalypse is inevitable, we're powerless in the face of corrupt government. Right now, we are in a spiritual wilderness. How are we going to use our radical imagination to splinter those facts? I call in the ancestor Miriam. I call her into this space between you and me. I ask her spirit to hold us. I ask her to gift us with her wisdom, to nourish us with her living Torah, to strengthen our spiritual chutzpah in our lives. The chutzpah to see possibilities for more justice, more healing, more creativity when it looks like there are no possibilities. The chutzpah to notice who is being left out of the story. The chutzpah to take our own audacious visions of a better tomorrow seriously. The chutzpah to challenge authority with wisdom. One of the ways that Miriam's spiritual chutzpah flourishes in the lineage of mystical Judaism is in the idea of Moshiach, or liberation. In the worst nightmares, our people would sing out, I believe with a peaceful faith in the coming of liberation. I believe. That tune you just heard, that was sung by Jews packed into cattle cars on the way to concentration camps during the Holocaust. What is Mashiach, or liberation? The mystics say this is not a man riding a calico donkey swooping down from the sky to save us. My own teacher, the mystical master Reb Zalman, he talked about Mashiach Zeit, messianic time, a movement through a progression of events with a liberatory consciousness, one that can find liberation in any place, at any time. When we practice spiritual chutzpah by investing in a vision of a more liberatory future, we are letting Mashiach Zeit into the world. That works on every scale. When you get into a fight with a loved one, and your mind starts racing ahead to all the ways you're sure your loved one is going to hurt you in ways that others have hurt you in the past, you practice spiritual chutzpah when you notice that you're letting your wounds colonize your future. When, with self-compassion, you pause and you begin to invest in daydreaming or journaling about positive alternative outcomes. That lets a little Mashiach Zeit into your life and into our world. We're living in unprecedented times. You have a role to play.
a role in which you are going to let more Moshiach into our world and your life. This isn't some gigantic role. I'm talking about a small role in which we take small actions that are the actual ways that everything is ultimately changed.
And nurture spiritual chutzpah to insist that our small actions can have major consequences. Remember that famous rule we know from sci-fi? If somebody invites you into a time machine, you have to be careful when you go back in time not to change anything. Don't smile at the wrong person, don't say too much, don't turn the wrong corner. If you do, when you step into the time machine and you return to the present, you'll find that everything has changed. Small actions can transform everything. And those of us learning Miriam's Torah, those of us practicing her spiritual chutzpah, we know this time travel rule works when we think about the future. We know that our choices can dramatically transform the look of our future lives and the world.
I recognize that even the active imagination can feel naive in a time like this, but this is the foundational act of spiritual chutzpah. Let's use our spiritual chutzpah to take a clear-eyed view at the suffering in the world right now, and then imagine a world in which we rise and obstruct evil plans, abolish billionaires, institute universal basic income, offer free, high-quality, wellness-centered healthcare for all, support the thriving of trans folks, establish a national Department of Peace, convert to 100% renewable energy. Taking the time to imagine the world that we want to live in is a powerful act of spiritual chutzpah. From that vision, action arises.
So let's settle in for a moment and work together on our spiritual chutzpah muscles. Let's take a deep breath in, hold it for a moment, and then a very long sigh out the open mouth. Pick one place in your life where you're feeling powerless, trapped, lost. Maybe a work situation, maybe a friendship, maybe something in the world. Anywhere that you feel is a kind of spiritual wilderness for you right now that feels not too overwhelming to try and work with. Kabbalistically, your left hand is your hand of strength, your right the hand of compassion. So if it's safe to do so, lay your left hand palm up in your right hand, also palm up, so that your hands make the rough shape of a heart. Your fingers almost look like wings. Imagine standing in your palm is a tiny figure of you in the situation of your spiritual wilderness. So if there are other people in this situation, see them also tiny in your hand, interacting with you in the way they do. As you hold this tiny diorama of your spiritual wilderness in your hands, notice, what feelings does this spiritual wilderness trigger in you? Frustration, confusion, depression, anger, anxiety, grief. Notice where these feelings live in your body. Don't push them away. Be tender. Welcome the feelings in for this experience, even if they're pokey or uncomfortable. Now imagine, far off in the distance, a river of purple, blue, indigo energy. This river is flowing towards you. It's the energy of the ancestor Miriam, a loving energy that has within it a calm clarity about possibilities for a better tomorrow that you can't even imagine yet. Let the indigo river approach at a speed that feels okay to you. When it arrives at your body, it encircles your hands and begins to flow into the scene of your spiritual wilderness, around your miniature body that you're envisioning holding in your hand, around the shapes of any other people or things that are part of this scene for you. The river touches every element of your scene with tenderness, with compassion. It brings ease into every tight place. It loosens the energetics of the scene. This is a moment to pray, to ask the river of energy, to ask the ancestor Miriam, what are the possibilities I'm not seeing? Where are the opportunities for me to act with spiritual chutzpah? What are the possibilities I'm not seeing? Where are there opportunities for me to act with spiritual chutzpah? Continue to watch the river of blue-purple Miriam energy flow around the scene, and maybe it encircles your entire physical body. Maybe it even fills the room you're in. Notice what shifts. You can pause the podcast and stay here as long as you'd like. When you feel ready, thank the little figure of yourself in your hand for allowing you to be present with it in this way. Thank yourself for permitting this encounter with uncomfortable feelings. Thank yourself for making the space for this exploration. Now, call attention to your hands. Use your hands to gather up that indigo energy wherever it's present, in your hands, in your body, in the room around you. Fold all that energy into a small condensed seed and put that seed of Miriam energy into your right hand, the hand of compassion. Place your right hand on your belly and your left hand, the hand of strength, on top of it, planting the Miriam energy within. Tomorrow, when you wake up, open your phone and inevitably stumble across some piece of bad news. Notice how your limbic system reacts. In that moment, pause and notice, what assumptions are you making about the future? I don't know what's going to happen. Neither do any political pundits. What I do know is how we can return to that seed of Miriam's energy in our belly, call on that seed to build our spiritual chutzpah, to foster dreams of impossible goodness, to take our own hope seriously, to act on it in ways that we can. In this way, we can raise the axe of radical imagination, we can splinter oppressive facts of life, and unleash a flood of justice, healing, and creativity. Remember, Miriam walks beside you. If she's your biological ancestor or your spiritual ancestor, her power flows in your blood. But what do you do in the meantime, as you're exercising spiritual chutzpah, as we're waiting for our audacious vision to become reality? How do we relate to the unfolding uncertainty? Join us next time for the second tool of Miriam's wisdom, Wait for What? The secret Jewish mystical meditation taught us by the ancestor Miriam, a gift for you in this season of your life. I'm Rabbi Jericho Vincent, and I'm so excited to take this trip with you, guided by the ancestor Mora, Miriam. This is a survival guide for a spiritual wilderness. I'll see you on the path.
Walk with me together through this wild and stormy land. Walk with me, my friend. Together, reach out and take my hand. Open up your eyes to the sunlight. Open up your heart to the sun. Listen to the drum beat so steady. winding road. Look around and together we won't fear what we don't know. Open up your eyes to the sunlight. Open up your heart to the sun. Listen to the drum beat so steady. Together we will overcome. Walk with me together as we cross this beautiful land. Walk with me, my friend, together, all of us, hand in hand.
Thanks to Ella Joy Meir for the beautiful original music, to Rabbi Tzvika Krieger for his Torah, to the Kanfei Edges group, to my creative partner Ben Blum, to Mor Miriam for her guidance, and to Ruach Olam, the oneness within, between, and beyond us all. Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness is part of the Judaism Unbound family of podcasts, made possible with support from Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And we're so jazzed to be here today with a new kind of Judaism Unbound episode, because this is something we hope is an act that all of our listeners are doing always with the Judaism Unbound podcast, with Tales of the Unbound, with now Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, our growing family of podcasts. We hope people are listening and then schmoozing about it with friends, generating your own Gemara, your own commentary on the Mishnah, on the first part that is the podcast. So for those not familiar, Mishnah and Gemara are the two names of the sections of the Talmud historically. And so what we're going to be doing over the course of the next few months, Rena Yehuda and I, is we're going to be listening to each episode of Jericho Vincent's amazing new podcast, Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, and then we'll be schmoozing about it afterwards. And so the episodes will be released on our feed just as they were now. I mean, those of you hearing this, you heard this happen, but you're going to hear the episode of Jericho's podcast, and then we afterwards will provide some little nuggets of what resonated with us, what questions it brought up for us, and hopefully that will lead to your own nuggets and questions. So that's a little bit of framing. I'm very jazzed to do this with you, Rena Yehuda, and to asynchronously get to hang out with Jericho, even if they're not in the room right now. And so I wanted to start with you. This first episode, Spiritual Chutzpah. I mean, if there were two words that were kind of going to distill the spirit of Judaism Unbound, I think that you could do a lot worse than Spiritual Chutzpah. What were some of the nuggets that jumped out to you as we took in this amazing set of narratives related to Miriam from the Torah and beyond?
It was a great first episode, and it was really exciting to hear Jericho doing so much work with the historical record in a way that completely remade the story, in a way that is also completely folded into Jewish tradition and the way that we think about storytelling. Though it is not yet Pesach, and it's an important reminder that it is not yet Pesach, it is not yet Passover, we are still in the process of preparing to tell and retell stories that have been a part of the Jewish tradition since its inception and are about its inception. And I think one of the things that is really cool about what Jericho Vincent is doing here in this podcast is, and they don't say out loud that they're doing this, which is a thing that I think makes it even better and is a thing that we should all feel empowered to do, is that they're taking the story of Pharaoh, they're taking the story of the Exodus, and they're bringing it into modern times, right? They're retelling the story in a way that makes it more clearly resemble the situations that we're in. It shows the historical resonances of the way that time is a spiral, and that we're always going through actually many iterations of the same kinds of dictatorships, the same kinds of authoritarianism. But B, one of the other things that's really cool about this is that this is a part of our Masorah. This is a part of our tradition. The ability to make and remake stories is part of what has made Judaism sustainable throughout the centuries. Part of the reason why the Jewish people are even here today is because we have this ability to do this incredible kind of retelling. Our ability to take story and tell it again and again and again, and to spin it in ways that help us see the ways that it's not only relevant, but actually we are living inside of those same stories, is part of our survival as a people. So it makes sense that they would be employing this tool in a podcast that's about surviving spiritual wilderness, talking about Bamidbar, being in the wilderness that comes after the Exodus. And when we think about the Pesach Seder, the Passover Seder that we do each year, that's us taking this story and finding ourselves in it. And it's really important when we're talking about spiritual audacity, or when we're talking about spiritual chutzpah, to be able to do this move where we take those stories and without saying, oh, this is just midrash, this is just creative interpretation, or saying, all right, now I'm going to do a modern mapping, you just do it. You don't do the scaffolding, you don't do any apologizing about it, you don't minimize the way that you're reading the story, because the way that you're reading the story is the story. Part of being a Jew in Jewish storytelling tradition is the fact that you don't have to make any kind of concessions about the ways in which you're reading into the story that is yours to inherit. For me, as somebody I studied history in school, I am now a comics artist and an educator and an editor, and I do all kinds of things that are not necessarily about that degree. But one of the things that I learned by studying history is the importance of understanding the archive. As a people, we have access to the most remarkable archive, and that is Torah, that is Tanakh, that is the Talmud, that is all of these historical texts that we have. People who might just take history classes or might just read history books might sometimes think that historical fact is set in stone. But when you study history through the archives, which is to say through the primary source materials, you understand that all historical narrative is entirely constructed. All of the facts that we might regard as being sacrosanct are actually interpretations that we have from archival materials. And historians have felt empowered to take those materials and tell coherent narratives out of the things that they find in archives. But as Jews, one of the things that's so cool about our tradition is that people are encouraged to take the stories that they see and to weave those archival materials that are a part of our canon into their own understanding about what that history is. And those stories are constantly in flux. When we look at right-wing authoritarian movements that we're seeing today, these are movements that actually understand the malleability of historical fact. These are movements that understand that you can tell a story in whatever way you want, and that the truth can often be quite flexible. That's a really dangerous thing to know, but in other ways, it's a very empowering thing to know. And it's very important that at a time in which we are facing rising authoritarianism, all of us feel empowered to tell a story in a way that is responsible and in a way that is truthful through the traditions that we have.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I also think that, to get specific about what Jericho did, there were certain moments where the story got incredibly detailed. I'm thinking of one in particular where Jericho spoke about the demographic realities of Israelites under Egyptian slavery. This tiny percentage, 1% had 90% of the wealth. I forget the precise figures, but they were putting out figures of a very tiny elite in Egypt having a huge amount of wealth and the vast majority of folks being fairly impoverished. And the numbers they used, I could say they were made up. We don't have any of that information about ancient Egypt, certainly not about any particular period within that we might try to connect this story to. Many of us think that this story is not a historical narrative, so even having any figure would be a little bit funny in that framework. But what Jericho did is grabbed contemporary stats on the United States and wealth inequality. And they did not preface that with, and now I'm going to connect the story of the Israelites in Egypt in slavery to our contemporary society. We can learn today about... No, they just did it. For some folks listening, that connection might have been clear. For others, maybe not. That's sort of the risk or the downside, is that when you don't state directly what you're doing, people may not know you're doing it. But I think that's part of what it means to be Jewishly creative and to have spiritual chutzpah, is to not always name that you're doing it. When you name that you're taking a big creative new step, it's a kind of submission to history. It's a kind of, I'm doing something new, and I need to let you know that, because if I don't tell you that, then you might think this is the real quote-unquote story of Miriam, or the real quote-unquote story of Israelites in Egypt. I actually think that this contemporary retelling is on equal footing with whatever other tellings. I would say that about the Prince of Egypt movie. I would say that about the Ten Commandments movie. I would say that about everybody who has told this story at different moments and drawn elements from the Torah, drawn elements from the Talmud. I'll add that Jericho, in very direct ways, everybody should check out the show notes for this episode on our website. Not just Torah and Talmud, Zohar, Dead Sea Scrolls, Visions of Amram is a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls that plays a key role here. And then their own intuitions and our contemporary world and American society. Like, all of that is in the stew pot that is the story Jericho tells. And they do it very matter-of-factly. They don't even nonchalantly tell us that this is happening. It's just that's the water this retelling is swimming in. And I think we need that, because we actually aren't impoverished for Jewish creative acts today. We have a lot of people doing Jewish creative work. But I do think that even many of the folks that have chutzpah, that are retelling stories, that are rewriting Jewish history, that are adding things to Jewish history, they're framing those actions as additive, as change, as different, as retelling, as opposed to just, this is the Exodus story, or this is Miriam's story. This is not like, oh, we have a new modern midrash. Like, that's true, but in a world that constantly writes off new versions of sacred text as sort of forgeries until proven otherwise, or made up, quote unquote, we actually have to have the chutzpah, the sacred audacity that Jericho so beautifully describes, to do the creative work without saying it's super creative.
I feel like this really gets at these ideas about what we consider to be truth and historical fact, and whether or not something quote unquote happened. It's a very modern invention. And it's a very Western idea of thinking about history, of thinking about the past, present, and future. As a Jewish people, we have a historical and memory-based tradition that is way older than that post-Enlightenment way of thinking about history. And so when I think about things like folk tales, or like you take, the story of the boy who cried wolf, and somebody asks me, well, is that a true story? What's meant by, is that a true story, right? Did that story happen word for word? I don't know. Is that story true? Yes, because it contains in it truth and wisdom. And so when we think about the story of Moses standing at Sinai with the tablets, or we think about the story of the Exodus, or we think about the story of Purim with Queen Esther, all of these different stories that we have that teach us where we came from and who we are, some people might be concerned about whether or not these things happened. For me, as a Jew who is interested in history from a lens that goes beyond this narrow idea of historical thinking, I look at these and I say, yes, these are true stories because they contain so much truth in them. And when we start understanding that our definition of a true story actually contains our own ethical and moral compasses, and that it's about actually the origins of truth that come from the framing of a story, not necessarily, oh, can I cite that this thing happened exactly this way? We get to a really new idea of truth. And so the spiritual chutzpah that it takes to retell a story without apologizing for the way in which you see the truth in that story is both a radical act and also something we've been doing since we got the Torah.
I'd say in the Torah. I mean, Rena Yehuda, like pop quiz, what does Deuteronomy mean in Greek?
What does Deuteronomy mean in Greek?
Second law. Deuteronomy is itself a retelling of, largely, it's a number of things, but it's Moses' like farewell speech just before he dies, and it's looking back at this journey that they've been on and retelling it. And by the way, he changes a lot of details. We could chalk that up to a bunch of things. We could say, well, Moses is old at this point and he might not have a great memory. And so he's doing what people do when they tell stories from a while ago, which is getting details wrong. We could also say maybe he's consciously changing the story because telling it anew and adding in some details or shifting things is a better way to speak to a generation that is entering this land. Maybe there's different stories needed for a people that is actually on the cusp of entering a land, like a new generation that is going to enter versus the people who experienced those stories and were dying in the desert beforehand. But truly, the fifth book, it's called Deuteronomy. In Greek, I mean, in Hebrew, it's Devarim, which just means things or words, which is the broadest possible name you could have for a book. But it's interesting, right? I think what you said is so wise. Like, when people retell the story, whether it's Boy Who Cried Wolf, or like, let's say there's different children's books with different illustrations and different stories about like Goldilocks and the Three Bears or the Three Little Pigs. When people tell that story to their children, they're not checking a text to make sure they got it right. Like they're telling the story, and like there's a few general things that you kind of, I think, are supposed to keep the same. Like if we're doing the Three Little Pigs, like the first house is straw, the second house is sticks, the third house is bricks. Like that's kind of core to the story. But honestly, you could probably play with those too and have the materials be slightly different. But like what happens and what is said precisely at each of those three stages, I think virtually everybody telling the story probably does a little bit differently. And like, look, some people telling the story, maybe each of the pigs has a name. Maybe they don't. That's what it is to share stories as a culture. It's actually not to have one canonical, fully truthful version with like footnotes and textual evidence that it's the quote-unquote original. It's to have a general framework and to allow that framework to inform storytelling from generation to generation, have it flow, have it ebb, have it change, have it shift. That's what sacred stories are. But Jewishly, it's counterintuitive because we do have lots of retellings of stories, but we've classified them very hierarchically. We've classified them as the Torah version or like the quote-unquote original, which wins. That's like the truest one. If you want to know what really happened with quote unquote the Israelites in Egypt, I think people would go to that before they'd go to the Talmud or Midrash or certainly contemporary fiction written as new versions of the story. But I really want to upend that idea, not to say that any of this is historically accurate, but to say maybe historical accuracy is not the point of these stories. The point is to convey deep messages that allow us to grow and thrive. And that, by the way, is what Jericho's doing. Like, we haven't talked much about Miriam yet. Like, Miriam, the character, is being recentered here, is being given the microphone, the center stage, and Moses is much more of a sideline character. That is a powerful act of chutzpah or courage. I'd like it to be less chutzpahdik. I actually think we should be doing that with all of our stories. But the way that Jericho does it and the way that they find in Miriam a model of chutzpah, of you're going to say, I don't really count here, or I'm not the central character. No, here's a bunch of texts where Miriam's a bigger deal. Here's a Sufi teaching where Miriam is a central piece. All of that is vital. And even though Jericho didn't teach it out loud with words explicitly, that, hey, everyone, we should be recentering characters like Miriam. We should be doing creative work with our text. We should be combining Jewish ways of interpretation with Sufi. But like, they didn't quite say that so directly, but it comes through. And I hope that we can take it in as teaching, even if it wasn't said verbally.
When you said that historical accuracy might not be the concern here, I would go even a step further. I would say it's not a useful framework. When we're looking at Western civilization, and we're looking also at histories of colonization and power structures and these broad systems that have evolved over the last 500 years in order to maintain power and control, it makes a lot of sense that you would come up with an idea of memory that requires a really intense power structure. That it says there is one truth and only specific people have access to it. And you have to cite it and go through all of these really specific hoops and go through this whole maze in order to arrive at the correct idea of memory. Whereas in Jewish tradition, because we've been a more democratized and frankly horizontal culture or set of cultures for such a long time, we have to have a more democratized idea about memory. And so even when you said like, oh, is these ideas of, modern fiction, even the idea of fiction versus nonfiction is so subjective. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, this famous comic about the Holocaust that is itself a historical record and a collection of interviews that he did with his father, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. Mouse, this graphic novel, A, the fact that it would be called a novel is questionable, and B, when the New York Times first published about it on its bestsellers list, it was published under fiction. And Art Spiegelman wrote a letter to the editor and said, hey, this story about the Holocaust is not fiction. I drew it using animals. That does not make it less real, less historical, or less true. To get into what you're talking about, recentering Miriam, of course it is part of a feminist tradition to recenter characters within a historical record that says there is only one right way to remember history. That part of a rebellion against that, or part of an expansion or a resistance to that regime of memory, is to say, actually, we are not going to continue to center the only things that this one tradition have said is important. And that we get to do this reinvention without even saying, oh, this is new, this is modern. It's not. To be able to have the kind of chutzpah, that's actually not chutzpah, it's self-esteem. It requires chutzpah in a context that says that's chutzpahdik. It requires the ability to see that action as being courageous and strengthened, when in fact, actually, part of the reason why it's even been categorized as chutzpahdik is to make sure that people don't do it, is to keep people away from doing it, because it says you have to be so brave and so courageous to do this thing that we're going to guess that most of you won't be. I think it's really important to say, yes, spiritual chutzpah is so necessary in a time like this, and to encourage people to have it, but to also say, actually, it's not even that much of an innovation, because it's actually always meant to be yours. It's just the power structures in place are keeping you from seeing that as your own spiritual inheritance.
It reminds me of the moment in this first episode Jericho shared. We're there at the Shabbat table, and there's this moment that hit me as a listener as just unbelievably heartbreaking, though not necessarily surprising, where they ask Dad, hey, can you share that teaching you just gave to the men in the room, to the men and boys in the room, in a particular language that only they speak? Like, could you share that with the rest of us? And the response is, somebody wants attention. No, it's what you just said. Like, Jericho doesn't, that's not something that is deeply chutzpahdik, that requires us to look at somebody and be like, oh, they want some kind of extra attention. It's what we would all pine for and yearn for in a community, in a group exploring sacred tradition, that we're all part of it, that we all get the chance to speak up and to hear others when they speak up. That action by Jericho, I love that this episode is called Spiritual Chutzpah, but I'm with you that in a dream world, in our messianic future, in our Moshiach Zeit that Jericho calls us to envision, that would actually not be particularly chutzpahdik. That would just be what it is to be at any kind of meaningful Shabbat table. And there's something poetic in reflecting on memory, what we think of as looking backward, and then tying it to Mashiach Zeit, to this notion Jericho brings about sort of envisioning a liberatory future. Mashiach being, the Messiah, or at least a messianic age, and Mashiach Zeit being sort of like the characteristics of such an age, and starting to literally envision that. I loved the meditation exercise that they walked us through. We can only do that future-based visioning when we sit with sacred memory, when we reflect on things like the story of Miriam, and then channel into our present and future. That's a give and take. It's not separate to have a Passover Seder one day and to have a creative new Jewish future the next day. Those have to be in concert with one another. The last little thing is that here's the deal. Jericho pined so badly to sit at that spot next to Dad at the table. Today, a lot of people pine to sit next to Jericho at their table, because they've become an incredible teacher of Jewish text and tradition and spirituality. I say that because Jericho is absolutely awesome, and because it is worth citing that story has a kind of happy ending, that all these years later, Jericho has a podcast that people want to listen to and engage with their Torah. But also because it's not just about Jericho. It's that all of us, every single person listening to this podcast, have sacred teaching to offer, and should be at the front of the table at Shabbat experiences and otherwise to offer their Torah. So my hope and blessing is that we can find moments for that to channel another teaching of Reb Zalman's, who Jericho cites. He would often have gatherings where he'd start at the head of the table, tell a story or share a teaching, and then he'd say, everybody move one spot to the right or move one spot to the left. And then a new person would be at the head of the table and he'd say, "You're the Rebbe." May we each do that, and in doing so channel the chutzpah of Miriam, who deserves a central place, who deserves a head of the table, and not just a sideline place with Moses at the head.
One other thing that I'd add is when we're thinking about Jericho at their family's Shabbos table, and the experience of feeling excluded from a tradition and knowing that it's yours, knowing that that's actually always supposed to have been your spiritual birthright. I think a lot about my own orthodoxy, or at least explorations into orthodoxy as a trans person, as the kind of Jew that I am. I didn't grow up being as halakhically observant as I am today. Part of the reasons why I went into that journey into a more halachic Judaism, or a Judaism that involves interacting with Orthodox communities. And I do live in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, with my exalted neighbor, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Part of the reason for that is it's about finding the gems that have always been meant to be mine. And while I might not necessarily live inside of those communities, I actually decided not to preemptively comply with the idea that I shouldn't be there. Jericho talks about how Miriam has the spiritual chutzpah to go up to her father and say, Pharaoh said that he's going to kill all of the Israelite baby boys, but by not having any more children, you're killing all of us, not just the baby boys. Part of what they talk about is that is what's known as preemptive compliance. That when the powers that be, or the social structures that exist, tell us that we can't do something, that you stop finding creative ways to create another tomorrow, and you actually kill off all of the other potential futures that could actually liberate us. When we're talking about preemptive compliance these days, when we think about the onslaught of executive orders that are coming out of the White House, some of which are not in lawful ability for the executive branch to execute, you see institutions like private medical establishments and hospitals denying care to trans youth at a time in which it is so necessary that we stand by all of the ways in which we can protect the most vulnerable among us. That's what's known as preemptive compliance. And when I think about all of the people who told me, well, you certainly can't be trans and Orthodox, I knew that was mine to have. And so I didn't listen to them, such that I was able to venture into places that most people would assume were closed to me. And while it's not an easy experience, and there are many ways in which there are barriers and struggles that come out of that, it's so important to not believe that when you're told you can't do something, if it's something that your neshama, the deepest part of your spirit and the deepest expression of Hashem, of God that you have in you, tells you that it's supposed to be yours, that you run after it. That's part of the importance of not obeying orders. That's part of the importance of not doing preemptive compliance. That's how we access the spiritual truths that are meant to be ours, because it allows us to be more creative about the ways that we approach futures that feel like they would otherwise be blocked off.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, and I'm grateful to you for bringing that. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. We really encourage you to subscribe to Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness. We will be back in about a month, Rena, Yehuda, and I, to take in episode 2 and beyond. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.